Hey guys, Currr14 here. I'm going to give you a tutorial of the SpinHUD. Some of the things we've done is add a lot of post-flop stats that are very specific towards a situation. We've also split the pre-flop stats into open and defending. And so I'll just go through the opening first. So here you have your open panel. You have when the button has an opportunity to open, and when the small blind has an opportunity to open. The next stat is the number of hands that you have recorded on that player. Then you have the VPIP, how often they min raise from the button, how often they 3x. So this is sizings that are above 3x, but not a shove. I think it's up to 7x. So anything 3x to 7x. Open shove, limp, how often they limp trap. So this counts hands that you've seen that are 2s plus, ace 2 plus, or king 10 plus. Limp fold versus a non-all-in. Limp fold versus an all-in. How often they're limp raising. How often they fold versus a non-all-in 3-bet, and how often they fold versus an all-in 3-bet. And then you have the exact same thing for the small blind. So VPIP, min raise, 3x, etc. Then the next panel is the defending panel. So this has small blind versus button, big blind versus button, and then big blind versus small blind. Again, you have the number of recorded hands for each situation. The VPIP, so this is when they voluntarily put money into a pot after like a min raise. So a limp obviously doesn't count. If they're facing a limp, that doesn't count. So this is facing a min raise or a shove. How often they fold versus a min raise. How often they fold versus a 3x. How often they fold versus a shove. Their ISO non-all-in percentage. ISO all-in percentage. 3-bet non-all-in. And then 3-bet all-in, of course. The last two panels are for post-flop play. So here you have, this is the button after they've min raised, how often they c-bet, how often they'll barrel turn after they c-bet and get called, and how often they barrel river. How often they fold to a raise on the flop, how often they fold to a raise on the turn, how often they fold to a raise on the river. This is fold versus donk, so how often the button will fold versus a donk, and then how often the button folds a turn after calling the flop donk. And then the last one here we have is fold versus probe, and fold, so this is a turn probe, and this is a river probe. Then we have the small blind. So this is in a min raise plot, this section here, and then this section here is in a limp plot. So how often this player c-bets after min raising and getting called, and this goes post flop. How often they barrel turn, how often they barrel river, how often they fold to a flop check raise, how often they fold to a turn check raise, how often they fold to a river check raise. And then when they check the flop, when the small blind raises pre-flop, checks the flop, how often they check fold to the big blind betting, to the big blind turn barrel, to the river barrel. And then you have the exact same stats for in a limped pot. So limp c-betting, folding versus a raise, and a barrel. So this one's a bit different. Instead of having folding versus a raise on the flop or folding versus a raise on the turn, this is fold versus a raise on the flop, and then fold versus a turn barrel after calling the raise on the flop. And then you have the same thing with the check fold. So how often they limp pre-flop, check the flop, and fold to a bet from the big blind, how often they fold to that barrel, and how often they fold to the river barrel. The last panel is facing c-bets, or facing aggression for the most part. So how often, this counts small blind and big blind, how often they fold to a C-bet from the button after they've called a min-raise pre-flop, how often they fold to that barrel, and how often they fold to that river barrel. How often they raise facing the flop C-bet, how often they raise facing the turn barrel or C-bet, and river. And then how often the player donks, and when they donk, how often they continue to barrel the turn, how often that player probes the turn, how often that player probes the river. And then these stats are strictly for big blind versus small blind play, so it counts nothing to do with the button. How often the big blind folds to a C-bet after the small blind's raised pre-flop, either 2x or 3x. How often they fold to that turn barrel, and how often they fold to that river barrel. How often they raise the flop, how often they raise the turn, how often they raise the river, how often they bet when check to, how often they barrel turns when check to, and barreling river. And then you have the exact same thing in limp pots. Again, same difference here. Instead of having it as a raise flop, raise turn, raise river, we instead opted to go with raise flop, barrel turn. And then you have how often they bet when check to in a limp pot.